Are we live?
We're live now, everyone. This is August Cole. I'm the director of the Art of Future Warfare project at the Atlantic Council. I'm a writer, and I'm joined today by three other writers who have recently competed in our most recent War Art Challenge, which called for envisioning space conflict at the end of the 21st century. And we're joined today by Eileen Kemmer, Mike Matson, and our contest winner, Alec Medden. And I think the course of the discussion for the next half hour will talk a bit about their individual stories, but also the way they work, the kind of visions they had that went into the work that they submitted, and was truly excellent. It's important to know that this contest was judged as well by David Brin, the best-selling science fiction writer, who will be at the Atlantic Council on May 18th this Monday for an event to further discuss this. Hey, Charles, how are you? We are joined by Charles Cameron as well, our other finalist, and so we have a full house, everyone. And so for the next 25 minutes, we'll get into the great work that these writers have contributed. Alec, I think we'll start with you. Tell a little bit about the inspiration that went into your story from a remove. Your background is unique in this, that you are the youngest who entered it, and a college student at Stratford University. So kudos to you for impressing us all. So I'll turn this over to you, Alec, and have you talk a bit about the inspiration for your story.
Alrighty. Okay. As for inspiration of the story, essentially, one of the original early ideas I had is I wanted to say something about drone conflict. That's kind of in vogue right now, and what I wanted to kind of talk about, what I've been noticing is there's a lot of the argument centers around how it seems to trivialize warfare for a lot of people, and I imagine, for the people that are fighting it, and I imagine that in the space conflict scenario, use of drones might come to the fore a bit more even than in ground conflict, just because you have these distances and you have difficulties of survivability, and even though cyber threats are very, very present, I think that people still would use this type of remote conflict. So I wanted to tell a story about how, even though the fighter might be removed from the combat, they would still have to deal with the psychological effects, and they still might actually have physical threats to their person. The other main inspiration really was kind of online environment that I've grown up in for the last few years, essentially. Growing up with this, I really didn't get into using the internet that much until just a few years ago, and I was really amazed by how much power it gave me. I mean, obviously I've grown up with the internet, but I really started studying military affairs and world news over the last couple of years, and just with my smartphone, I felt informed. So I kind of wanted to tell a story about what if that feeling of empowerment and that level of connectivity kind of transitions into the political realm, and that's where the sovereigns came from. Is what if we were able to create social constructs and social contracts over the internet without the specificity of location that exists in modern day government? And I want to mention now that one of my inspirations for this was a short story by the name of To High from Far Selenia, kind of a weird name there, by Carl Schroeder, because he does mention in that short story Internet Nation. And while the idea had been kind of forming in my head for a while, and his story, they're kind of more of a background dressing. The main meat of the story deals with something else. I want to mention that story because it was really helpful in the creative process. They're not really anything like the sovereigns, but just the idea of somebody blatantly coming out and calling something the internet and making it.
Alec, one of the really interesting things that you portray in the story is being able to run a war essentially from a tablet, and that distance from conflict being something that is, as you pointed out earlier, this remove is a feature of the way we see conflict today on the cusp of the 2020s. At the end of the century, as we push that further into these greater distances that will be covered, and you think about space conflict, how do you feel that there is going to be a way to keep people connected to the costs, the risks, and the the sense of opportunities lost when people do go to work.
Well, I think this is something, and this is something that's central to the existence of the sovereigns in my story too, is virtual reality and just general digital communication. I think will greatly improve human empathy over the course of the next century. I think being able to, with more and more advanced versions of virtual reality, essentially step into the shoes of different people all over the world can really bring the costs of war home. I mean, I remember being amazed over the last year, thanks to just YouTube and people I follow and all the military affairs sites that I follow. I mean, you're able to see live, well, not live, but you're able to see footage from just days ago of combat zones and the difficulties that people have to go through. And not just combat, but just the daily life of people in these regions. You have essentially people live blogging about their experiences. And I think that as this becomes more and more immersive, I think it'll be very difficult for people to separate themselves from the costs of conflicts, even at a great distance, if they're truly informed people.
Irene, in your story, I would sense that you maybe are less optimistic about the future in that sense. Tell us what you think.
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm less optimistic personally. Personally, I feel pretty good about what the possibilities are. I guess it would depend on the actions we take now in terms of that kind of future. And it was interesting, when I started writing, this is the first story that was actually sort of purposefully constructed. I had never before, I usually start off with a bit of inspiration, we'll start writing. This one I actually just sat down and I said, okay, characters, who are my characters, and I started off, that way, which was an interesting experience. And so once I had established that, I wanted to, one of the main characters was going to be a young woman, and her, which was kind of inspired by the readings I've done at Strategy Bridge on mentorship and things like that. Yeah, it turned out dark, but I guess just because to showcase what could happen, and I want to avoid, in a sense. So that's where that came from. But on the whole, I am pretty optimistic about our future.
Well, it's good to have a little bit of optimism, at least, injected into the conversation. Mike, I want to turn to your story because you are a second-time presence in our featured entries for the Art of Warfare Project because of the strength of your writing. And so I would love to hear a bit about the way you view the potential tensions with artificial intelligence and how that may manifest in the context of space conflict. But most importantly, you also took a very character-driven approach to your story, which I thought was very effective at making something that can be often a very abstract conversation quite real.
Yeah, from the AI standpoint, I think when I started writing this was right when Bill Gates had come out and said on his blog that he was terrified of AI and the potential of what AI could become in the future. And my take was, if someone like Bill Gates is afraid of AI, maybe should pay attention to at least what I'm trying to say about it. But I was just, a lot of this was actually just going forward from looking at today, and actually this story was a spin-off of the first one. Where the first contest where we had to do the next Great War, I included first ever space combat where they were taking out satellites. It was a satellite war, and so I basically said, all right, if 75 years from now there's been conflict and we're militarizing space, what's the reaction going to be to things getting blown up? And that's where the fusion of having tens of thousands of satellites up there, because you can't hit them all then. Yet there's redundancy. But to do that, you need something to control it. And with everything on Earth being connected to the Internet of Things, I was looking at today that every piece of tech I buy for my house going forward is going to have the ability to be connected to the Internet. Right now, all my stuff is still not connected, but it's going to be connected. And something is going to need to run all that over time. Down to my toaster. I could buy a toaster now that's connected to the Internet if I want to. So going forward, everything is going to get together. conventional systems are not going to be able to manage it. I didn't talk about quantum mechanics, but that's sort of where I would see the processing going, and the AI functions behind that would just at the end of the day we would have to relinquish control because it's just too much to handle. There's too much data. I think I used the word yottabytes in there for the amount of data flowing around on an hourly basis, and that's only because that was the largest size piece of data that I could find when there, terabytes, exobytes. That was the last one on the list. I would have gone higher if I could.
So the kitchen counter potential front future conflict with AI as much as the upper reaches of the atmosphere. Charles, your piece War in Heaven, you like Mike are a second-time featured writer for the Artificial Warfare Project. The creativity that goes into your work is extraordinary, and it is really something to behold. And I would love to kind of get your sense of the historical arc that you see as we progress coming through this century to the end of the 21st, beginning of the 22nd, because your stories are so richly laden with that larger kind of historical continuity to big themes around Armageddon, around the kind of most macro questions around existence and man-machine too.
I'm having a really hard time hearing you, and I'm not sure kind of what that is. It's partly that I'm a bit deaf. But
one of the things I would love to hear about is the sense of historical continuity and the elements of Apocalypse and Armageddon that feature into your work.
Okay. Yeah, Armageddon has been, or different forms of the end of the world have been a fascination of mine. I think since I first read William Blake many, many, many years ago, and about 15 years ago, I was in a thing called the Center for Millennial Studies, which brought in scholars from all over the world who were dealing with various forms of apocalypse. And just this last week, I was in Boston for a conference. It's like a continuation of that organization dealing specifically with the Islamic State and their apocalyptic agenda. So that's been a continuing interest of mine for 50 years at least. The other part of that is that as an ex-think tanker, I've kind of been trying to watch how far ahead we can actually guess with reasonable accuracy what's going on. And I think part of my sense is that the future is very, very hard to predict, that there is so much that can happen that we can't even envision. Just, I mean, thinking about my mother kind of saw the very first cars or motorbikes happening or whatever it was. I was there before Sputnik happened. Now we have, I guess since the 1980s I've been focusing a lot of my attention on computers and computer-mediated communication. These things are changing so rapidly, and what the next new thing that will shift direction strongly is a very, very hard thing for me to tell. I also think that there's a kind of a genre that science fiction has established in the same way that there's a certain amount of definition given to what a spaceship looks like by hundreds upon hundreds of different magazine and book covers, and they all have crafts that have little rivets in them, and somebody made this remark, I can't remember who it was, but science fiction has rivets and science fantasy has trees, and that's how you tell the difference. I don't want to land in a stream of thinking that's already preconditioned by what science fiction keeps on doing, but somehow to think aside from that. And my particular interests being really the religious imagination lead me to try and see alternate worlds of various kinds, and that are mainly metaphysically different rather than necessarily kind of physically. They don't necessarily fit NASA's model of what's going on.
No, indeed they
Uh,
don't, but that's why they're so valuable. And it's something, Alec, that makes me wonder how you see your peers reflecting on the coming decades and the relevance of manned spaceflight. You know, for America now not having the kind of attention, both budgetary and almost in the national sense, towards this objective that games really, for example, on an Xbox or a PlayStation, are a more likely avenue to understanding what the future of man's role in space might be, rather than almost anything else these days. I mean, occasional films, but really games seem to be that portal. So talk about the role that your character Danya, plays in that, helping us kind of decode that dynamic.
Okay. Oh, and first I'd like to mention, well, I don't know if I'm sure that focus on manned spaceflight is a little less than maybe during the Apollo missions. I would still like to say that a lot of my friends are incredibly interested in space travel. My roommate is a huge fan of Elon Musk. We're kind of like Elon Musk fanboys. So there's still definitely that focus, and I think there's people that are still focused in space, even without games. But yes, I will answer your question about Danya. I think Danya's connection to space travel, I kind of modeled it after the Major League Gamers in South Korea, mainly, and how they fill up stadiums. I pull up the number that she trained for 18 hours a day. I got that from a Vice News documentary. I didn't make that up. Kids actually train that much. And what you find with different space simulators, there's a famous one, Kerbal Space Program, if any of you ever heard of it, which simulates space travel to a degree of accuracy that is really shocking. You can use all the same Newtonian equations to calculate what you do in that game and what you would do in real life, and they all work out, as far as I know. So I think that I love the idea that she gets a primer in the most advanced systems of combat from these video games. And this is something that you see in a lot of regions. I mean, yes, like, for example, Call of Duty. While I don't know if it maybe connects to the emotional reality of war, it certainly connects to the technological reality of war in terms of what's coming out, what rifles do people use, what emergent technologies are appearing. So I kind of love that idea that she gets an introduction to the cutting edge of warfare from video games first. And then when she's actually thrust into a conflict, she can do everything she's asked, but she really isn't prepared for what warfare actually is and what it means. And granted, I understand that pretty much nobody is prepared for war, but I love to deal with that aspect where people kind of, you see it in television and movies, and you think you understand what space might be, what war might be, but you really don't when you come down to it. So that's kind of where her character came from. She's kind of this cocky, like, already kind of know-it-all type character who's really smart and almost deserves that attitude, but she's thrust into an arena that she's really unsure about and unclear about. But she does her work as best she can and comes out to a certain extent successful, victorious.
Irene, you also have a very strong female lead character, as do you, Mike. But I would like to hear, if you, as writers, Mike and Irene and Alec, we can kind of go in order there. See a sort of role that, in a lot of conventional understandings of the role that men are playing in combat, that in space fiction we are seeing more female leads. I think of Aliens as a great example of Ellen Ripley, that series.
Oh, so am I going first?
Yes, sorry, I clicked the wrong button.
Oh, yeah, I think in terms of space combat, I think a lot of the issues right now are obviously, reading the media reports. It's about women's physical ability to meet certain standards, and I think that once those barriers are removed, it's pretty much all psychological and intellectual. When it, in terms of space combat, it those barriers are taken away. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it's a great answer, Mike.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I mean, the talk right now is like they're watching the people going through the Ranger class or the Marine Corps basic training, but where women have been really successful and where those in the like the U.S. military said that those be interested in combat would want to go is aviation, for example. The number one unit that women who are interested in going into combat positions want to do is the Night Stalkers, the special forces aviation unit. So when you take away the just the pure physical differences and you're relying on intellect, spirit, so forth, then space is a perfect leveling ground for that because unless you're getting into something like a Starship Troopers, it's going to be reaction time. It's going to be warrior spirit. It's going to be the psychological, whether you can survive the mental aspect of combat almost more so than the physical. Because space is so hard, it pretty much levels the playing field for the hardships on the physical side.
Alec?
Oh, about okay. Yeah, I'd say, personally, I think that in any arena, I mean, because, given that, yes, on average, women might be less physically able to commit tasks than men, but I think that in any arena, land, air, space, what have you, I think definitely there will come a point where both any gender, they will all be on par. As long as there will always be people of any gender in any group who are strong enough and willing enough to fight in any situation. So I think that the playing field will become level on ground just as it is in space. But I do definitely agree. Space provides you. It's like that Starship Troopers line. It's like we're going to war by pushing buttons. Obviously, that isn't the case in Starship Troopers, but it is definitely it's definitely kind of a field where it is more the mind. And as the separation between our technology and our very brains, ceases to exist, there will be neural interfaces. There will be connections between machine and mind. Physical ability might start to become less and less important as we're controlling drones, or as we're simply just controlling our bodies, but our bodies are augmented. They might have exosuits. They might have something in our bodies that make us more stronger and more effective. In space, we'll be controlling spacecraft. Anyway, yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to go on.
Charles, that leads me to what will be our last question as we're running up into our half-hour time slot. But Charles, I'd like to follow up and ask, given the context within your stories about those notions of consciousness being a very malleable concept and one that is yet going to be very decisive in the very most strategic sense in the future and perhaps even this century. Could you talk a little bit about some of the thinking that you put into War in Heaven and how that manifested in your story? Charles, I think your mic may be muted.
There, I had to find my cursor and bring it over. There we are. One of the things that interests me about the discussion we've had so far is the notion that there's a blurring of distinctions, that the body may get extended, that the mind may get extended in such a way that the distinction between this is me and this is my prosthesis gets wiped out. And we are therefore perhaps at a point where you can't really tell psychology from physiology anymore, or you can't really tell the material from the morale anymore, that they get really strongly interwoven. And part of the result of that is that we do not yet have the language for covering things. So I found that as I was writing, I kept on having to come up with neologisms that would somehow give people a little bit of a clue as to what the new reality was from different angles, and realizing that those neologisms would eventually fade into disuse if the world proceeded in such a way that various things became natural. One would no longer particularly refer to them because they would just be obvious. Whereas from the perspective of now, they're hard to even imagine. From the perspective of then, they may be so much taken for granted that nobody would ever mention them, or that the word for mentioning them would have fallen into disuse. So the very interesting aspect of all this that has to do with the idea that morale has an immense influence on what goes on, but that what that influence is, how it will work in, roughly speaking, inconceivable futures is pretty accurately inconceivable. So in many ways, I was going directly into imagination and making stops at various different aspects of imagination. I mean, at one point I was referencing the Martian canals from whatever it is, 1890. But we're outpacing our imaginations is part of the issue here, part of the problem, I think, and also a great deal of the fun that we really have to race to catch up with what's already breaking or what will be breaking 10 years from now.
Well, Charles, that's a great way to close our conversation with the Art of Future Warfare project today. I'd like to thank you all for joining and encourage those who are watching to go to artoffuturewarfare.org to read these entries and other writing of conflict. Thank you again for joining us today. Tune in next Monday at the Atlanta Council when we have David Brin joining us at 1 p.m. Eastern for what promises to be a great follow-up. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.